Hi, good evening. I'll take this
Yes.
to be on time.
Okay.
Talking about time. This was a tight one. I would like to welcome all of you. Of course, it's always good to see such a large crowd, only for the simple pleasure and noble cause of literature. I would also, of course, like to welcome Mrs. Hanagihara. We just met, we shook hands, that's it.
We did just meet about 30 seconds
Nice
ago.
to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you too.
She was straight from the TV studios in a taxi. How was Van Gils en Gasten with my colleagues?
It was wonderful. It was a little surreal. It looks like it's been drowned in red velvet. And Levin himself was very, very nice and very smart. But it's not often that you get to be in a program discussing your book, Soul Sister, and Justin Bieber, and so it was an interesting mix. I mean, maybe that will be what tonight is too. Yeah,
We'll try.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know about Justin Bieber, but I'll try.
Yeah, okay.
Ms. Hanagihara is here on invitation of Porta, the International House of Literature, of course. So on behalf of Porta, welcome everybody. Normally, this evening would have taken place in Porta, in a wonderful bookshop in the center of Brussels. But since there were so many of you wanting to be here, we're here in Flagey, so thank you, Flagey, also. Are you already used, Mrs. Hanagihara, to sit in front of a large crowd? Is it normal for you, worldwide?
I don't think it's normal. Call me Hanya, by the way, because
I'll
I'm
try.
going to call you Ruth. So, but I don't think it's ever normal for a writer. I mean, there's a big difference between writing, which is a private act and an interior one, and then getting to actually meet people who have read your book, which is a joy, but a public act. And so I think, like many writers, I feel a great disconnect, but mostly it just feels wonderful, and you never quite get used to it.
Yeah, it comes with the job, the perks of writing a bestseller.
Well, I mean, the thing about a book that reaches more people than you ever expected, is that it's so random and it's just luck, because there are so many wonderful books published every month, and you hope and you pray most of them will get attention that they deserve, and they don't. And so when you're lucky enough to have it happen to you, which is so terrifically rare, you enjoy every minute of it, even if you feel like a fraud,
It's not just luck.
No,
like a fraud, is it frightening also sometimes?
It's not, well, I suppose what's unnerving sometimes is that people think that I'm a better friend than I am, and that I have more answers than I do. And you just find yourself talking and talking and talking. And at some point you realize, my God, I sound like a giant asshole, but you keep going and going and going.
You have to.
You have to. So take everything I say with a grain of salt is the lesson.
Because it's very similar to the life of a pop star. I mean, tomorrow, what's your day like tomorrow?
Well,
you don't want to think about it yet?
Well, I don't even really know.
I know.
I mean, I'm going to drive by in an armor car and girls are going to throw panties at me. That's what's going to happen.
That's what's going to happen.
No, but I think I had this in the book, and I think it's actually very true, that one of the reasons that it's so difficult for pop stars to become actors, for example, is because part of the allure is they're unable to disappear into themselves. They are who they are. They are the performer. And the best pop stars are the ones who the self is inseparable from the performer. And I don't think any other artist is really like that. Actors aren't like that. Writers certainly aren't like that. So I think the only group of artists for whom performance comes naturally are musicians, pop musicians probably. I'm sure if someone will tell me I'm wrong.
But the similarity was more in you have to get up and do interviews all day tomorrow. So there's no way of letting go tonight.
Well, it is a great privilege. I mean, one of the things that I think is different about being a writer and having people be interested in your book is that the communion between a reader and a writer is special. I think it's intimate, it's more intense. When you read something that you really feel has been written for you, it almost feels, to me at least, like an insult when someone else says, "Oh, I love that book," because you think it's my book. I'm the one who discovered it, and that book is meant for me. And therefore, there's something charged about meeting a reader who's reacted to your book. you feel that they feel that you've written it for them, and to a certain extent, you feel that they've discovered you. And so it is a specific kind of relationship.
It's intimate, but in a different way.
It is, but it's a joy. I mean, the fact that this book has found the readership it has been a terrific surprise for everyone, and it never ceases to be something I marvel at.
Let's talk about the book then, because you keep saying the book, but I've got two books here, right?
Right.
Well, the first one might forget.
Well, believe me, the first one no one read, so it really is the book. I think, the Dutch publishers, I think, were the only people who bought both, and the American publishers. But they're very different books, and I think, and consciously so, I really tried to change not only my style when I moved to the second book, but I knew it would be a warmer story. The first book's very chilly, and it's remote, and on purpose. Yeah. But books like that tend not to endear themselves to readers, which is, of course, not why you write a book, but I didn't expect that it would find readers, and it didn't.
But is that something you did on purpose? Because the first book, I suppose you read the second one, A Little Life, but the first book is about a real-life person.
It is.
It takes a distant voice, and you already said it's a distant kind of novel. But it's about someone who got the Nobel Prize and who was sentenced for pedophilia. So
yes.
It's a happy coincidence. That never happens, so that's a very strange story.
Yes, it's a very strange story, and it is, as Ruth mentioned, it's based on the life of an American physician named Carlton Gajusek, and one of those great stories where the stuff of his life was stranger than anything that a writer could invent. And from a very early age, I knew, because he was talked about in my household and because my uncle worked with him, that I would write about him someday. And it took a very long time. But everything that a writer would love to explore, every idea about being a great man versus being a bad person, about colonialism, about cultural relativity, everything was within his story. And so I had to wait for him to die, which he obligingly did eventually, to write it. But it was a story that I knew, and I think this is true for many writers, I knew that I had to write it and only I could do it, which is where the arrogance comes in, but that's how you have to feel about a book.
Otherwise you don't write it?
Exactly. I think that it feels urgent to you and that only you can tell it.
It was your story.
And that was mine, yeah.
Because, as you said, it's very different, but that book made you a writer.
Yes, technically, yes.
Yeah. And strong
did,
enough to start the second, because you might think of the second as I'm doing the motion. I don't know the word in English. Coming from the first one.
Yes.
I mean, maybe even an answer to the first one. There's a very important sentence, maybe the last sentence of the first book.
Yes.
In a very gripping, we're not going to spoil it for you, moment. And then maybe the second book starts.
There are clues to the second book in the first book. There's in particular for, those 5 of you who have read it, a character named...
Five More Will,
named Francis Talent, who is the narrator's object of adoration. And Jude came from him. And you can see it in a very loose sort of way. But although the second book isn't meant as an answer to the first book, they are, I suppose, in conversation. And people always assume that because both books contain pedophilia, that's the similarity, and it is to some extent.
Yeah, it's no coincidence.
It's not a coincidence. No. But to me, the link between the two, the stronger link between the two, is this idea of, it's about the abuse of power, which is what interests me about child sexual abuse. And it's also about how, much like the disease in the first book, which lives in the body for decades before triggering, trauma too lives in the body of the main character in A Little Life for decades before he's fully aware of it, and then it begins to destroy him. So I think both of these books are about the body and the mind falling apart at different paces, and often before the mind is quite aware of what's happening.
Yeah. While you're saying this, the body and mind falling apart, and the way you describe it in both books, and you're saying this with a pretty smile and a cheery woman sitting here, that is quite a dark side of you, Mrs. Hanagihara,
Well,
if I may say so.
you know, people talk about books being dark or people being dark, and I don't think that I think some people are more inclined to be morbid, and I don't think I'm one of these people. But I do think that all of us have the potential, some of us, again, more naturally than others, to let our minds wander into upsetting territory. And one of the ideas I wanted to explore in A Little Life is this concept of good and evil, and are people good or are they evil? And I hope what the book suggests is that they're neither, but the choice to be good is simply that. It's a choice. Some people can make it very naturally, some people make it unthinkingly, but some people, like JB, for example, or like myself, have to work at it. And I hope that the book really is an argument for human agency, that it's too easy to blame chemistry or nature, when really every human, and this is what makes us human, has the opportunity to choose to be moral or ethical or not.
But you don't get to choose whether you're a victim or not.
No, you don't. And you don't. And one of the things that my editor and I talked about a lot was why Jude is victimized so often. And I told him, and I do believe, that for many people who have been victimized, been hurt by others, it leaves a mark on them, and they keep going back to the only thing they know, even when they know better, even when logic tells them otherwise. And there are people who can also smell that sort of victimization on people. And some people, like Willem in this book, are kind in the face of that victimization. But some people, like Caleb, are not. And so, again, I think there are people who have a sort of a sixth sense about knowing when people are wounded, when others are damaged. And it's what do they choose to do with that information that separates those who are admirable from those who aren't.
And when you are the victim, because now we're talking about Caleb and about Willem and how they react to a victim, because they also smell it's a victim. But the victim itself, Jude, does he have a choice afterwards?
I think one of the frustrating things about this character is that as a reader, you know what he should be doing. You know that it seems so simple for him to step away or to stop. And yet, one realizes that things a person really needs to be equipped with, a sense of entitlement, the right to say no, the right to be angry, are things that are taught in very young childhood. And if you don't learn them then, you never learn them. It's terrifically hard to learn. If you're never told as a child, it's all right for you to be angry and I understand you, even if you get punished, then that right to anger, that privilege of anger, is something that becomes increasingly difficult to possess.
So this is a multiple trauma, like from every side. And is it impossible to, is the word in English process, to cope with it, to get over it?
You know, I don't know. I do think there are some people who endure a level of trauma that is simply too much for the human mind to bear. And I don't think it's measurable. I don't think you can say, well, this needs to happen, and this needs to happen, and this needs to happen.
And then you're doomed.
And then that's it, right.
Okay.
But I think for some people, yes, there's a point at which the mind as computer stops being able to turn over. And then the human is left with a very difficult choice of what to do next.
And that was the story you wanted to write?
I specifically wanted to write a story that answered a redemption narrative. This idea that which is very popular not only in the States, but in most of the West, that if you try hard enough, if you work hard enough, if you hope hard enough, you'll be able to heal yourself. And a lot of culture is based upon that philosophy, but I don't think it's true. And I also was dismayed by how casually cruel or dismissive we are of people who find life too much to bear, of people who find life unendurable. And I think the words that we use, particularly in the West, coward, he was a coward, he gave up, he gave in, are so unforgiving of what it actually means to be alive in a mind, with a mind that torments you and in a body you hate.
Talking about the abuse, and you said the abuse of power, that's what interests you most when it's about child abuse. Of course, there is very obvious. What about the aspect of the too much of it? You already hinted at it yourself. It's like, it just doesn't stop.
Right.
So you've got readers who came to me in the last weeks and said, it's fantastic. I had to cry.
Right.
And then there are readers, not much, and they say, it was too much. I didn't believe it anymore. Is it, it's possible, right? It is possible.
It is possible.
It is possible. It's unbelievable, but it's possible.
I wanted the book to feel, and I don't quite know what I mean by this distinction myself, but I wanted it to feel true, even if it didn't always feel believable. And a lot of this book pushes past the limits of what's strictly credible. And when I was having it read by my first reader, I told him, if there's ever a line, I wanted it to feel extreme. And I said, if I'm going to try to walk as much as I can that line between drama and melodrama, but if I slip over, I don't care.
Whatever.
So it was a stylistic choice to make it excessive. But the amount of brutality and violence in Jude's life, I thought was not only, I hate to use this word, justifiable, but necessary. And it's because fiction's job is to show lots of different kinds of lives. It's to depict the lives that we know and we can see, and the lives that we don't know and we can't imagine. And some lives are brutal, violent, painful, and terrible lives. And I wanted the reader to never forget that this was Jude's existence. This was a man who went home and was horrible to himself every night. This was someone who lived with the horrors of what would happen to him every day. And so even if the trappings of his life seem pleasant, I wanted the reader to be Jude's company. And there are times in this book in which Jude has no one, but he always has the reader. And if the reader stays with him, she is, in some sense, his witness and his protector throughout his life. And the violence, the cutting in particular, is like a little string of melody that repeats itself over a symphony, and never lets you forget. These are the 3 or 4 notes that are the first building block for this piece of music.
He has the reader, but he also has the writer. You lived with him for how long?
Not that long, for 18 months.
You're still living with him, though? But
yes, very much. Yeah, very much. Very much.
18 months, 700 pages.
Yeah, but it came very fast. I mean, I think, if any of you in the audience are writers, you create a world of a book for years. And the strange thing is you're sometimes not even aware you're doing it. And that was certainly the case for me. So I had probably been thinking of variations of this book for 5 years prior to actually beginning to write. And one of the reasons that, and I always tell this to young writers, one of the reasons it's so hard to begin is because the best period of writing, in a sense, is the writing, the before writing, because then all of the universes and possibilities of this book exist. Once you start writing, you start killing them. And you start setting a path that you have to follow.
And you knew where to go.
I did, but it was, for example, this book was originally going to be structured very differently. I knew what I wanted to write about. I knew who Jude was, but it was going to be in 2 parts and an epilogue. And the first part was going to be Jude, as you see him in this book, a highly competent, highly resourceful, damaged man with his friends. The second half was going to be about a character named Jude again, with these characters also appearing, but he was really going to be sort of a ruin of a person, someone who wasn't able to fit in society, someone who wasn't able to function. And then the epilogue, the coda, was going to be what had happened to him. And I'd always been interested, and still am, in what makes a person seemingly able to compensate for their past and what doesn't. You know, in American trials, for when a criminal's on trial, the defendant's childhood, if it was a bad one, is often brought up as a mitigating factor, as an explanation. And I do think that's true, but what makes a person able to avoid that kind of life and not? And it's often, again, to use an unfortunate word, luck. It's luck. It has something to do with a person's resourcefulness. It might have something to do with their innate talents and skills, but often it is just luck. And the unsatisfying nature of that explanation was something I wanted to explore. But that structure felt very artificial, and so I abandoned it.
And also, then you would have chosen for somebody who doesn't fit in society, and then it's maybe easier to process because you can look at him from a distance, and now he's just one of us.
Well, yes, and I also think it establishes this binary that someone who can't function in society is somehow a failure, and someone who can is a success. And that's simply not true. I think that's too reductive a way of thinking about a person.
Let's talk about, you said it is possible, because in a way this is maybe a new genre, probably. I think I compared it somewhere with, you know, when we read The Road by Cormac McCarthy, nobody says, oh no, this will never happen. It's, no, this is, no, because then we know, okay, this is science fiction, I suppose. So that's okay. We know that. But this feels maybe even like in science fiction of the inner world. A dystopian.
That's an interesting way of thinking of it. I mean, I thought of it as a contemporary fairy tale. And, you know, I think what separates a genre book, as we call it, from a non-genre book, from fiction, is that, you know, a science fiction book is about the fiction of science. You know, it's about the creation. What takes center stage is about this created philosophy, if you were.
And nobody says this is impossible.
But The Road is about humans. And all fiction, that to me is the great. That's to me the great mark, the great divide between them. And I hope that for as many liberties with the contemporary novel as this book takes. And frankly, if you can't take liberties with the contemporary novel, what can you take liberties with? And you should be able to. That ultimately it is about the question of being alive and what it means to be alive. And the skin of the story might be different, and the conventions of it and the excesses of it might be different. At its heart, it asks what every novel has since the beginning of novels, I think.
Were you shocked that at a certain point, and now we're talking about it again, you have to almost defend yourself for the excessive pain in the book? Because, why? Maybe because it's something, because there is a possibility that this is something that might happen. Maybe that's why it's frightening for certain people.
I think there's a few groups of people who are really concerned about the violence. Number one, people who are just put off by violence. Number two, people who are unsettled by it for reasons they can't quite explain. Number three, people who have specific ideas about what novels should be. And number four, and this is the most interesting group, and I think the group I get most often, people who aren't quite sure how they feel about the book and want some sort of explanation. They want me to help them articulate what it is about the book that they find both vulgar and irresistible. And I don't mind doing that.
That's a wonderful compliment, by the way.
It's an interesting intellectual exercise for me, and it has really made me ask, why isn't there more explicit violence in literary fiction when there is in every other artistic genre? And why do we, as a culture, think it doesn't belong? Why do we think that, you know, explicit sex belongs in a novel. War belongs in a novel. God, what else is there in life?
Everything.
But why doesn't
I can name a few things.
Yeah, why doesn't brutality? Why doesn't physical brutality?
Yeah.
Why have we decided that that's not a place that a novel should go? And I'm not sure what the answer is. But all I can say is that if a novel can't be about violence, then the form is broken, or it's too narrow.
So we had the vulgar part. Let's talk about the irresistible part, because it's there. And while reading it, I really thought it's been a long time since I forgot that I was reading, and it was even quite a shock because I was just living with these characters. And you said in the beginning something about the tone of voice that is very different in the first book and the second book. You wanted something endearing. Was that the word you used?
Yes, I can't remember, but
Empathy,
endearing's
maybe?
good. Endearing's good. We'll go with that.
Did you have in mind that the reader would feel empathy, that the story would grip the reader?
I think it's very difficult to set out and write a work and say, well, I want the reader to feel this,
Okay.
or I want the reader to feel immersed. You rarely are, because the alchemy of, I think, what makes a reader respond to a book or connect with a book is simply that. It's unknown. It's something that witches are cooking up in a pot somewhere. And I think the book starts feeling very cheap if you think, and manipulative.
Yeah, then you're
If you
working
think,
towards something.
Yeah, if you
yeah.
think, I'm going to try to get this reaction here, and this reaction here, and this reaction here. All I can say about the book is that I hope what readers are responding to in part is that I wrote it not for a readership, I wrote it for my best friend and for myself. And I think because to me, it was such a personal book, it was such a love letter to my best friend, that I hope that part of what the reader is responding to is that sense of intimacy that I think the book invites. That it may be a conversation between me and my friend, but I hope it's generous enough to allow readers to participate in it as well. And the other thing that I hope readers respond to is that I think it's an honest book. It might not be stylistically to your taste. It may not go in directions you like. Its logic may be its own or indecipherable. No, but I think it's an interesting question because when we talk about why we react to a work of art, it's always an interesting thing to analyze because in a way it defies analysis. And with this book, I think that I never lie to the reader in it. The reader gets the ending that is the only ending that could be, and the reader, I hope, has the sense that I'm really experimenting on the page, and the reader has the sense, I hope, that I'm unafraid of making big mistakes and taking big risks on the page.
Is the fact that it's irresistible? Maybe you talked about boundaries. There's too much of everything. I mean, it's 700 pages. Nobody does that anymore. There's too much, so it's wonderful. There's a lack of things that have too much of everything.
Well, I will say, unlike many American writers, I didn't go to a writing program, and I think there's something rough-hewn about the book.
Dare you?
I know, but I do think, and I was aware of this as I was writing it to some extent, that it feels like a book by someone who didn't know the rules she wasn't supposed to break.
That is a very smart remark. Did you prepare that? Do you say that every evening?
No, but I have said it before because the nature of writing a book is people want you to explain it, and I don't know. I mean, maybe I should go to an MFA program and figure it out.
Let's talk about. You said something interesting. You said it felt like I was writing a love letter to my best friend. Now we have two things there. We have love and friendship. There's no difference in this book. What is it? What is love? What is friendship? That's a very interesting theme also, and rarely written about.
But the idea of friendship not being a central part of our lives and a central part of literature is a relatively new one. Shortly after I finished writing, or this book was published, there was a wonderful book by Vivian Gornick that came out called The Odd Woman in the City. And in this book, she talks specifically about the relationship, the friendship between Wordsworth and Coleridge. And she reminds us that this idea that a friend is someone to whom you show the worst part of yourself is a modern invention. That up until, maybe the end of the 19th century, a friend was to someone to whom you showed your most virtuous self, the best of who you were. It was someone around whom you tried to be not only the best version, but the most moral version, the kindest version, the most elegant version. And and then, with romance and the idea of marriage being a source of romance, which is a relatively recent development, let's say a 20th century development, the idea of friendship as being elemental began to drift away. And so I see it almost as a revival of an old tradition of literature, in which a friend is the person we get to choose and with whom we announce to the world who we are.
A friend as a better family.
Maybe, but not just that, but a better self too, I think.
I'm thinking about the book now and all the friends who would be the better self of the... Because then sometimes, as happens in the book, you have two good friends. And friendship can be so important and so wonderful that sometimes it's mistaken for love. But that's not a bad thing.
Well, I think that the friendship is a romance, the friendship at the heart of this book, for those of you who haven't read it. We won't spoil
Everybody
it.
read it. So we're talking about Jude and Willem,
okay.
right? Okay.
So it's a romance. And I think one of the things this book suggests is that a friendship itself as a relationship can be anything you need it to be or want it to be at any particular time. Sometimes it verges into sex and sometimes it doesn't. But the idea of a friendship as a romance, with everything that word implies, is I think something that many of us have. We just don't have a name for it. And the word friend, as Willem says at one point, is such an inadequate word. As many people before me have observed, it's a verb now. And the specialness of it is diminished. And so when you have a friend with whom you're very close, and let's say it's not a sexual relationship, but it's something else, it's a friendship plus, you have to use that same word, and it feels, you want to announce it to the world differently. You want to explain to the world, well, it is a friendship, but it's also something more. Here's what it is. And there isn't a word for that, and it's what these two characters struggle with.
Yeah, because when they're together then, they're not more together than they were. Maybe even less.
No, I think that, these are two very unimaginative characters, and they spent a lot of time trying to make their relationship adhere to an existing model, and the fit is imperfect.
Because when Willem, let's talk about Willem, that's an interesting thing too. He develops feelings he already had, but anyway, for Jude, and also Howard, how he wants to, adopt Jude and stuff like that. They both lost somebody. So they're also just trying to fill in the gap. That doesn't work, does it?
Well, I think it works imperfectly. I mean, I think you're right, first of all, that there's also a romance between Harold and Jude. But another thing I hope the book asks is, we're so interested in where our love for someone comes from, or where someone's love for us comes from, what's motivating it, what's its genesis. And we often fear that it might be pity. And yet, what's wrong with love being based on pity? I mean, both of these men's love for Jude is based in some part on pity. And I hope the book suggests that it doesn't matter where it comes from, how it's generated, what matters is the fulfillment of it and the day-to-day of the relationship, the day-to-day of the love.
Also, they're not the binary thing like you want to be loved because somebody thinks you're so special and exceptional.
Right.
Just pitiful.
Right.
It's as beautiful as
Right.
being
Exactly.
wonderful.
Yeah.
What is it between Harold and Jude?
Well, Harold was, one of the. I'm just going to back up a bit.
It's okay
and say,
because I have the impression we're talking about people we know. Is that okay? It's like they're here. Yeah.
Well, Harold was a wonderful character to write, and so was Willem, and they're both hugely flawed. I mean, when people say to me that they think they're perfect characters, I think that they end up doing Jude a great deal of damage in certain ways. Harold, because I think he does have this sort of fanciful notion that he might adopt Jude and become his father, and underestimates the amount of parenting he needs until it's too late, and does adopt him on a whim to some extent, as an expression of love, genuine love, but without really thinking about what it means to commit to another person, especially in this sort of relationship and in a legalized way. And of course for Jude does understand what this means, and it fills him with terror. And Harold doesn't quite recognize the severity of how damaged Jude is. And for Willem, and this is something that my friend, who's also my reader, and I worked on a lot. He's somebody who is used to pretending and hoping that things will become the way he imagines them to be. And I wanted a character who knew that Jude wasn't enjoying sex, who knew it. I think you can always tell, and he definitely knows it, and he's experienced, and he chooses to ignore it. And that is something that we do often in life and with the people we love, is pretend that if we hope it's so, that it might become so.
So they both, at first sight, we think they both love him most, but maybe they refuse to see who he really is, or
Yes,
how damaged he is, to what extent.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is because they're hopeful, because you don't want to recognize it in others. But again, and this goes back to the brutality in the book, if we really are committed to seeing somebody, then often it means recognizing the things that we don't want to see.
Because they're also the ones who want him to stop hurting himself, of course, but they want him in therapy.
They do, but...
And in a way, he has the right not to go in therapy.
Right, he does.
Why should he?
Well, and it's an interesting, this is something that my friend and I also argued quite a bit about. What was their moral obligation? What is your moral obligation when someone is injuring themselves, and helping them means perhaps temporarily depriving them of their dignity and their agency and their autonomy? Do you do it or do you not? And I'm not sure what the answer is. I probably would have let him keep doing it. But my friend said no, it's inhuman to do that. And I think that one of the things that the book discusses is this idea that you can't save another person. The beauty is in trying. The beauty is in knowing it and trying anyway.
And failing.
And failing, but keeping at it anyway. But along the way, there's going to be difficult moral decisions that will always be wrong to some extent.
And also, the obligation to, and then we're talking about, about male characters. The obligation to talk. You have to go in therapy, and you have to talk, and you have to tell it, and it's also for a writer it's interesting because it's words. Everybody says you need the words. Once you will articulate them, things will go better. But that's not how it works.
Well, that's a great point, and so much of what these characters repeat is I can't say it, I can't say it, I can't say it, I don't have the words, and so. Simply because you don't have the words doesn't mean that that expression won't come out somehow. it might not be in language. It might be in some other way. It might be in brutality. It might be in self-harm.
In hurting yourself, yeah.
Yes. But, this is, I think, a psychological book that's very much against psychology. And I didn't want readers to diagnose Jude. I didn't ever want to use clinical terms when talking about him. I wanted them to accept him as a complex person with a number of very grave problems that couldn't just be bundled up with one term, borderline, and tossed aside.
Mm-hmm. That would be...
Although many shrinks have written in to try to diagnose him. And they've decided that he's a borderline narcissist with PTSD.
So he has everything.
Yeah, he has everything. He's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, he has a little bit of everything.
Like
he has too much.
Yes.
Yeah. I bet they want him on the couch.
Yeah.
But was it difficult to write the really, harsh parts? The priests, the juvenile
yes
detention.
and no. In the moment I was writing them, not really, because I knew it. I knew what I was doing, and I knew where the story would go, and I knew what Jude's past was, and it came. And those parts are actually very short, and it wasn't until I was finished that I realized they don't add up to very many pages. It's a relatively brief amount of actual text. But I wrote them very fast, and they came completely. It wasn't until after the book was finished that the effects of living in this world and with these characters, and also that I had left them, became apparent to me. In a strange sense, you don't think too consciously about the world you're creating while you're creating it. You think about it every day, and you're with the characters every day, and you're talking to them, and you're hearing them, and you're thinking of bits of dialogue or certain phrases or certain scenes, and you're scribbling them down. But you're not examining your role in the creation of the world.
That's
if
the
that makes
backlash
sense.
Afterwards.
Yes, that happens afterwards. That happens, on the seventh day when you dust your hands and you walk away, and you realize you've made something that you can't control anymore.
And then what happens?
Well, I think that any of you in the audience who are artists, or at least this is what I thought, you think, well, I'm done with the project, the book, and now it's time to move on. That's it, goodbye. And the world, then after a certain point of trying to forget it and trying to separate yourself, you realize that after a certain point, you've somehow moved from being the creator of the world to being a recorder of it. And the world's not done with you until it's done with you. And one of the joys and, I guess it's mostly been a joy of talking about this book for so long as it's been published in other places is that I am much more engaged in the life of this book still than I thought I'd be. And if it becomes a TV series, then I'll be engaged in it again. So it could be many years, actually.
And that's a good thing.
It is a good thing, but you mourn the characters as well. They are, by this point, they're more than something living. They're the way it's the way that the ancient Greeks probably lived with their gods. It's the sense that you're aware that they're alive still, but there's somewhere you can't find. There's somewhere else in the world, and you know they exist, but you no longer know where to find them.
Mm-hmm. But we started out this bit of the conversation by talking about the writing of what we presume the more difficult parts to write, or it's not that you said back home laughing probably, especially with the scenes in the motel with little Jude. Do they come back to you then? Because you said, I live with the characters still, I mourn them also, but these scenes, do they leave you? Because they don't leave us as a reader.
They don't leave you. And, the other thing that I've actually thought about much more after the book was finished than during the writing of the book, especially as I've heard from different readers and have simply had, in a sense, the distance to think about it, is that there are people in the world who live with trauma that is unforgettable, you know,
Massive,
and I knew this sort of intellectually while I was writing the book, that I don't know how it is in the Dutch translation, but in English, as the book continues, the book moves constantly between past and present tense, but as it gets towards the end, it does sometimes in the space of a paragraph, as Jude really realizes that his past is not something that can be contained or compartmentalized. It's something that lives with each, and lives with each heartbeat, that the line between the two blurs and shifts more and more and more as you get older. And it's not until recently that I've really understood what I knew but couldn't feel. And I don't know why that's so. But I am vividly aware that there are people who, like Jude, are living with the unspeakable.
Mm-hmm. Are you vividly aware of that because a lot of people probably come and tell you these stories because they read you and you came close?
Well, you know, I haven't been surprised, but I have been shocked at some of the letters I've gotten.
Of course, yeah.
And, you know, of course, you know, as any editor or any critic will tell you, the facts of a novel that seem the most unbelievable are always lifted from life. And you can never say as a fiction writer, well, this actually happened, because, you know, if it doesn't sound true, then put aside believable. If it doesn't sound true, then it doesn't make a difference if it's actually true. But having some of the stories that people have told me since this book was published have been, I mean, they've been extraordinary. They've been they've been things that I could never have invented.
The things people do to each other.
Not only the things they do to each other, but the things people endure, the things people have made lives around. One of my friends had a very, very nice phrase for it, which I've since stolen and used it a lot. But she said that there are people who the best they can hope for is to make an accommodation with life. And I thought that was a very good way of putting it. That trauma isn't something that you overcome, and your past is not something that you forget. It is something that you accommodate to different degrees, and some people are able to do so to a much greater degree than others.
When we talked about the scenes in the motels, for us, that's very, I mean, we know that from movies because we don't have those long highways and hotel rooms. That makes it very American.
Yes.
But also we, as a Western European reader, we know that. But still, you went inside. That was a strange experience, I thought. It was very vivid.
Well, I do think it's a very American book, and it's American in the ways that it thinks about success and ambition and money and redemption. All of those things that are discussed in the book, that are present in the book, are not only American obsessions, but they are American obsessions. This idea that to be a successful person is to be an accomplished person, whether that accomplishment is, you know, being a sports star, or being rich, or having a lot of degrees from schools that are prestigious, or so on. But the other way I think it's very American is that it pays homage to the iconography of America, to the highways, to the motels, to the transient nature of life in America, and to the possibilities of America. One of the things that I told my editor was that the wondrous thing about the country and the horrifying thing about the country is that it's so large and there are so many places to hide that the lives that we know are the lives we know, and then there are millions that we never will, that are unimaginable. Shortly after this book was published, a colleague of mine at the time told me this story, which is one of the most chilling stories, and I think about it often. She was in the woods, the Muir Woods, which is a beautiful national park in Northern California. And this really sounds like something of a fairy tale, but she's not that imaginative, so I knew she wasn't making it up. And she ran into a little boy, maybe 11 or 12, and she said he was very poised, friendly, well-spoken. And they chatted, and he said, do you want to come back to my house for a cup of tea? And of course, you're not allowed to live in the Muir Woods. It's a national park. But she was curious and with her husband, so she said yes. And she followed him, and there was a little shack, and he was living with his father off the grid. I mean, they were living in the middle of the woods. And they started talking, the boy and his father and my colleague and her husband. And she said at some point she realized it wasn't his father, that they were in a sexual relationship, that they were a couple. And she said she didn't know what to do. She froze. And he seemed so normal and so, self-possessed. And she said that she and her husband left, and as soon as she got back to the highway, she called the police, but she never knew what happened. And that story to me it is the horror of America. It's a country big enough that anything can hide in, and where lives move past one another and they barely touch, and then they keep going. That the country is a highway, and you're always in motion, and you're never settling. And that feeling of uncapturability is something that I wanted to put into the book as well.
Never settling, that sounds like you.
Well, at some point it becomes a political statement to never stop moving. And
Is it a statement?
I think it is. I mean, if you look at certain fringe elements of the American population, one of the ways they've interpreted America is by being unpinnable, by evading not just law but society and expectations, and that's not me.
No.
No.
But you tend to live in one place now because that was different when you were younger, right?
Yes, so when I was younger we moved a lot, but that's not atypical for Americans, and I've lived in New York for the past 21 years now.
So you became an adult in New York.
Yes.
Like the characters.
Yeah.
Because when you start reading this, the first 50 pages, I mean, that's a whole different book.
Yeah, it is.
That was on purpose, I suppose.
Yes.
You feel totally comfortable and you think you know what will happen because this is what's going to be okay for friends, and then, whoa.
Yeah, yeah. And the book changes, there's many genres in this book. There's a fairy tale, as I've mentioned. There's a thriller-like aspect to it. There's a mystery. There's a beloved literary subgenre, the post-collegiate New York novel, which I love.
That's how it starts out.
That's right, and that is how it starts out. And then by part 2, you realize it might be something else. And then by part 3, you realize it might be something else. I wanted the book to feel like a shapeshifter. And I wanted it, I suppose that there is something unpinnable about it. That it whenever you think that you have a handle on what it might be, I hope that it shifts again. And I hope it feels slippery in a sense.
Was it important that the characters in the book grew old?
Yeah, I mean, the book is also very much about aging, about, and also the brightness. I wanted the tone to be very bright in the beginning because that is for many of us who are privileged enough to go to college and then move to a city and do the careers that we have, the careers we want to have. That is what your 20s feels like. You feel you're hopeful. You feel there's a sort of indefatigability of hope that exists. And then as you get older, of course, it changes. Your friendships change, your expectations change. The sort of dance that every adult has between hope and resignation, the ratios of that change. And so I did want it to tonally also echo what it means to get older. And I also wanted Jude to become more aware of his own damage as he was able to contextualize his life more. When you're in your 20s, you're barely out of childhood. You kind of can't see your life for what it was. You can, but perhaps you don't realize all the consequences. By the time you're in your 40s, you do. And the things that, I know people that have found themselves more and more troubled instead of less by things that happened to them when they were young. When you're in your 20s, you don't even think that you're thinking that you'll forget it. You just assume that you will. The body and mind does. And then you realize that you can't outrun it.
You just said that the book is evasive in a way because you can't pin it down. What if they pinned it down as they did, as well, you were all of a sudden the great writer of the gay novel? How did that feel?
Well, I don't read reviews, so I actually haven't read this one, but I know the critic, and I thought, and I knew he was going to write it.
Wait a second, why don't you read reviews?
I just think, what's the point? I mean, you're never going to change the way I write.
You might be curious.
No, I think, writers are very self-absorbed, and it just makes you more self-absorbed. I just don't, I'm too weak. I mean, that's really what, I'm too weak.
No, is that it?
Yeah, that is it.
I understand.
And I know I would become more self-absorbed. And, I don't want to be one of those people with the Google alerts and said about myself. It's just, it makes you, then all you can talk about are the reviews. And that's really boring, so I just don't want to do that. But I know this critic, and he's a wonderful writer who has a book called What Belongs to You. That's really a gem. And so I knew he was going to write this piece, and I thought it was just this terrific, imaginative reading of the book that I had never expected and didn't intend, but I was so honored by it. And I know enough of what he wrote. His argument is that the book has a queer aesthetic, that in its sense of operatics, and its bigness, and its excessiveness, and its extravagance, it owes something, say, to the films of Douglas Sirk, or to La Traviata, or to the queer classics of the Western canon.
You weren't aware of that.
Sorry?
You were not aware of that.
Well, I wasn't aware that I wasn't consciously trying to fit this book into that tradition. But I was very flattered and honored by the reading of it. And one of the great, unexpected delights of this book has been that so many gay men have seen something of their lives in it and have responded to the book with such generosity and have reached out to tell me, and that has been a real pleasure and a lovely surprise.
The way you talk about it, I get the feeling you're not over and done with it. Is there ever going to be a third book?
I don't know. I mean, as I said, I think that, again, it has to feel urgent.
Okay.
And right now, I'm not sure if anything feels as urgent as writing this book felt, or writing the first one for that matter.
Because, well, they're here, both of them, and when you look at them, it might even frighten you that that's what you've done.
No, because the next book, if there is a next book, will be very different. It won't be. I have said what I wanted to say about the subjects in this book. And that feels, not that I think anyone's ever finished with a certain subject, and not that I think of A Little Life as a manifesto, but I have, I think, said what I needed to say most urgently about friendship, about trauma, about memory, about love, for now at least. You have to leave a loophole,
Yeah, no, that was good.
Thank you.
Wait, memory. Because we haven't discussed that. You said 4 things, and memory is something we haven't discussed. Because, well, how do we get it as a reader? Do we get it? It's you. It's the writer who gives us Jude's memories, right? Is the writer, in a way, Andy, who is maybe the most? Andy is the one who maybe takes care of Jude in the best way?
I don't know. And also, my best friend thought that Andy was horribly irresponsible and should be put in prison, but for not committing him. I don't know. I mean,
so you belong in prison. Sorry.
Right. Well, I'm going to answer I'm not going to really answer the question, but to me, the writer who writes the most magically, the most compellingly about memory is Ishiguro. And all of the books are about memory, all of them, and about the tyranny of memory, how we avoid memory, how we use lack of memory as an excuse to behave passively and sometimes terribly. And the thing that, aside from the richness of the ideas in the book, in all of his books, every single book is different. Every single book is made anew. There's always a different setting, and yet the sentences are very much his, and the sort of undercurrent of ideas are always his as well. Which is not an answer, but those are the best books about memory, I think.
There was no question either.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll ask a question now about memory.
Okay.
So you're talking about Ishiguro, and how did that influence you? What did you try to do with memory here?
I think this book is very much about the tyranny of memory, about how it's simply not something that one can outrun. And it's not even a question of what you choose to do with that memory, of those memories. I think we have this idea that you can control them, that you can minimize them, that you can sedate them. And of course Jude has that feeling as well. But I don't think it's true. I think that if you're cursed with a clear memory of what has happened to you, and yet a lack of equipment to understand it, then it becomes something that controls your life. And I don't really know that I have anything else to say other than that, that it's an exploration, I hope, of the impossibility, in a sense, of memory.
Mm-hmm. The equipment to deal with it. So the last sentence of the first book, so I'm sorry, I'm gonna spoil this one, is I think I'll take it. So while there's a rape, right? The rapist says, I love you. I give you my heart, to a child. And of course then you don't have any ability later or equipment, because then love is this, love is pain. So that's why I said that this book just emerges from it. If that's your memory, then, well, you're bound to give up. Give up is not the word, of course.
I think you're bound to struggle.
That was the word, yeah. So, about the third book. No, because is there pressure?
No, I mean, I'm not under contract, and...
No, but from yourself.
Oh.
The contracts.
I would like to be writing again, and just because when you're not writing, you always think, wow, God, I would like to start writing again, it feels so great, and then you start writing and it feels so horrible. But I would like to be, one of the best times to write is when the rest of your life feels uncontrollable somewhat, because you do get to play, I mean, this is a cliche, but you do get to play God a little bit. And it's a secret. It's something that's yours and yours alone, and that's why the writing part is so precious, because no one else is looking at it, no one else is telling you what you can or cannot do. It's a time in which the point of creation, the months of creation, are the headiest time, and that was true for both of these, even though the first one was horrible and took such a long time. It is the time in your life in which you have absolute freedom, and that can be said. That's so rare, and it's so hard to find for so many people, that you feel lucky that you have those months or those years in which you really get to do whatever you want. So I do miss that feeling of getting to do whatever you want. You can break any rules you want, you can ignore any of them, you can change anything you want. There is the great liberation of being unwatched.
Mm-hmm. Does that mean then, while writing, are you a happy writer, or is it a struggle? This is very binary, of course.
Well, I think I'm a disciplined writer, and I've always had a job while I was writing, and so part of me feels that before I start writing, I need to get another job. And I'm on kind of a middle-aged gap year now that's going to run out fairly soon. But I need the structure of a job, and I need someplace to go during the day that takes me out of the life of a book. I find it very helpful. And
it wouldn't be possible to write all day?
No, some people can do it. I just don't think I can. I know I would fool around too much. And I know that because it's such interior work, you need to get out into the world. You need to be around humans. You need to listen to how they talk and how they move and what they're concerned. And it's not that you can't invent those things, but if you're writing about humans, as all novelists are, then it's field work, and I need that kind of field work.
And then when you come home, it starts.
Yeah, then it starts.
Because you work during the day, and then you feel,
Right.
I can write later on.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But it's also a form of working. Having an office job is a form of procrastination too. You know, when you are avoiding the difficult stuff at home, that's when you're cleaning the house or you're doing laundry, you're doing something accomplishable. And because writing is so, usually it comes in fits and starts, and it's not measurable, that it's very helpful to have something during the day that is measurable, that you can say, well, I might not have written anything, but you know, I edited this piece and I talked to the photo department about that, or what have you.
Something.
I finished
Yeah.
something, yeah.
You get a lot of inspiration from other artists, photographs particularly, but images. Is that the first thing, or is there first an idea and then the images come, or do you already have a pile of photographs waiting?
And for this second book, it was the photographs first, the images first. Yeah.
What was the first image?
It was Diane Arbus's The Backwards Man in His Hotel Room, which is an early work of hers. Deanne Arbus, I should say. Her name actually is pronounced Deanne. And it was before she was still using 35 millimeter film. It's a vertical picture. And it's of a man standing in a motel room. And you look at it and there's something wrong and you can't quite figure out what it is. And then you realize he's wearing his clothes backwards. And then you look again, you realize that his feet are pointing one way and his head is pointing another. He's probably a contortionist, when she was shooting a lot of contortionists in those days. And when I saw it, maybe 2006 or 2007, it's such a perfect picture of loneliness and of being, you know, literally at odds with your body. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm going to write something for that photo. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that I'd been collecting these images, and that tonally all of these images had something to do with one another. And that's when I really started to put it together.
And then what happens? You put them on the wall? Or
I put them on a Pinterest board so I could look at them. And I didn't speak directly to any of them, but it was again about the collective mood that they encouraged. And this book is a mood book, I think, in a lot of ways. And it was trying to capture in words what those images conveyed in tone and in color and shadow.
What was the color?
An indigo, probably.
An
but
indigo
a nice indigo,
book.
yeah.
And so are there new images lying around?
Well, the one, I don't even know the name of it, but I know it'll be the cover for something. It's a Goya painting. God, what is it called? It's The Three Witches, I guess. And there are these figures floating in the sky, an astute man walking across the earth. So that's one of them. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. But you don't have to elaborate, but does that mean that there's just, like there was in 2006, there's just something that's lying there and...
Yes,
or is it already more
No,
advanced?
in this case, if I have a stronger sense of how it would unfold.
Okay. But the urgency is not yet there.
Not really.
No. That's because you're here.
No, I think it's...
No, but isn't that? This is, I mean, it'll be translated in French soon, and then this can go on for years.
The French haven't announced when they're actually doing. We keep asking them, and they keep not answering. So who knows? But the Germans are very on the ball. They're very on the ball. Not surprisingly,
they're Germans.
Yeah, they're Germans. No, there'll be, and I feel I can enter another world while I'm still in this one. It's just like most writers. I think most of the writing gets done in your head, and then the actual construction work starts later.
Has it changed you, the fame?
I don't think so. I mean, it hasn't changed the way that I live. day to day. That's, I haven't, the best thing about the experience has been, I'm always drawn to people who not create culture, but who curate it in some sense, and who work with artists, those have always been the people I admire the most. And so one of the great joys has been meeting publishers and editors and gallery owners and curators who I really admire, and getting to talk to them, because, so many of the characters in this book as well are people who help facilitate others' work, and it's been special meeting many of these people who spend their lives doing that.
Is that an underestimated role in life?
I think it's difficult. I had to work with writers when I was in book publishing, and it's awful. It's really bad. So I really applaud people who enjoy it. And a lot of people in book publishing really enjoy being with writers. I never liked it.
Why not?
Because writers are, by and large, they're very inward. We're very inward, I should say. And it's, listening to writers talk is boring. It really is. Just on a day-to-day level. I find it interesting to hear writers talk about their writing. But when you have to talk to them about the logistics of getting through a day and turning in a story, it's hard, it's dull and it's frustrating. And, it was so frustrating for me, particularly as an editor, a magazine editor, because I thought, well, you're an artist, it's true, but we let artists get away with too much bad behavior. I'm an artist too, and yet I turn stuff in on time, so if I can do it, you can do it too. And I think that we are living in a culture that simultaneously devalues what artists do and lets them get away with too much.
Artists, writers are very inward, you said. I think one of the first things you said here this evening, and it almost felt like an excuse, was, oh, this is where the arrogance comes in. Is that a bad thing? Was it difficult for you? Because you also talk a lot about the intimacy while you're doing it and not yet out in the world. Is that a difficult part to say, here I am, I'm a writer, and here you are? And I did not attend a writing course.
Well, again, I think the special part is, and this is really sort of what every writer hopes for, and when you're lucky enough to have it happen to you, it's an experience you never get tired of, is hearing from people who have read it. And that's it. It's again, I know I said this at the top of the conversation, it's such a special relationship. And it's, and there is some sort of bond between the writer and the reader. But what that is, and I can't quite articulate it really.
It didn't happen with the first one.
No.
Neither. It's like, do you regret writing it? Because you said it's like...
No, I don't regret writing it, but it was a very difficult book to write, for many reasons. As I said, it's chillier. Structurally, it's much more complicated. It's a series of footnotes. It was much more ambitious in certain ways. It's much more, there's science in it, which is very hard for me to really intellectually grasp. It's a trickier timeline. It was just a more complicated book technically. And and the character, although I respect and love him, was simply fun to be around. It was fun to create. But he was intellectualized to a degree that sort of defied affection, I suppose.
You would do it differently now?
I wouldn't do it differently, but I did wonder why, at various points, why I'd chosen something so complicated. I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad it was my first, because it was very, very hard for me to do.
Yeah. Did you want to prove something?
I didn't want to write a sort of typical first novel, by which I mean I didn't want to write a coming-of-age story. I didn't want to write something that seemed noticeably based on my life. I wanted to do something difficult. I wanted to do something hard, and I wanted it to be, and well, frankly, part of it is I wanted to write the book before someone else did. I thought for sure this story is too good. Someone else will write this man's life, and I want to be there first. So there was also a competitiveness to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a big competitiveness. Yeah. Because you say I wanted to do something different maybe than all the other writers, or the first book, the typical first book. And then again, when I say, well, the big success didn't happen with the first one, oh no, maybe that's a good thing. What if it happened with the first one?
I think, I think what really has also made the success of the second book both exciting, but also not revolutionary for me, I suppose, is I think it's very difficult when you write your first book and you're young. I was middle-aged when I wrote both of these, when I finished both of them. And, writing is one of the few artistic fields in which you can be any age. It doesn't matter what you look like or where you're from, despite what people may tell you, it just doesn't. And if you publish when you're in middle age, you are already a full person. You're not an author, you're someone who writes, and there's a big difference between them. And you better know who you are. You better be something other than the success or failure of your book. Because if you're not, you haven't done the work of being a human, I think.
And yet you say, I don't read the reviews because I'm too weak.
Yes.
That's where the boundary is.
Well, part of being human is also recognizing where you're weak.
That's a nice sentence to end upon. You're good at ending things.
Thank you, Ruth.
Also in those two books.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very, very much.
I would like to tell everybody who's here, I think all of you want a signature. It's possible, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It is. But some cards will be handed out so that you can write your name on, so that it'll go very smoothly, because otherwise we'll be here for 2 more hours, and there's a tight deadline tomorrow, I guess.
Oh, is there? God, you keep referring to this schedule that I haven't really
Sorry.
looked at, which is worrying me.
So she's got all the time in the world.
Yes, thank you. That's better.
You can tell her your whole life and how you like the book. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.